Hi YouTube, Angela Fair here. I just want to share with you an answer to a question I received from a viewer the other day. What she told me in her email was, I'm having trouble with blooms in my painting. Those big watermarks, cauliflowers, whatever you want to call them, she couldn't figure out where they were coming from. She says, I have good paper, which is often a culprit if you're not using great quality paper. So she said that's not the issue. She had the best paper, the Arches watercolor paper that I recommend. Good supplies, good paint, good brushes. And so she wasn't sure why she's still getting these watermarks when she does have good paper and just isn't sure what she's doing wrong. So let's talk about that. And what I want to tell you, and I think the principle that's happening here is really simple. Where is your water going is the question I want to ask you. So when we're painting, you know, we're using paint and water, so we know that when we tilt our paper, things are going to want to flow downwards, and especially if we're on a wet paper. Let's moisten things a little bit here. So you're on a wet paper, and you can see right away as soon as I add a color, it flows, it moves, and it follows the path of the water. We know that water has to go somewhere, and if it's just sitting there, well, it's going to do stuff too. So here we have, you know, quite a fluid area. We've got water flowing. That color is going to go somewhere. I add another color to my mix, and it's going to flow wherever that water is. If I add it to the edge of the page where this side is dry, well, you can see it's not going to flow on that side. It will do lots of bleeding here, but it can't go anywhere there. There's a line that stops it. And what happens is water has to go somewhere, or if it stays put, it's going to leave a line. It's going to have a boundary. And so let's say you're working, and this is where the blooms start to happen. You've got this beautiful wet area and you're adding color in, trying to build up your colors. And so you add in a nice damp brush stroke, and I'm just using water, but you could pick a color as well. Let's see here, some cobalt blue. So I'll put some cobalt blue in here, and as you can see, again, because my paint is wet, my color starts to move. That cobalt blue is flowing. The water I dripped in, it starts to push the pigment that's already on the paper. But over here, I'm getting a bloom happening. The reason this happens, that we're getting this edge, is because the water has to go somewhere, and when it stops, it leaves a line. And what happens is, as your paint and as your pigment dries on your page, it gives the water less place to move. That color just can't flow the same way. I'm going to try with another color here, some violet. And as things dry, I get different effects. As long as it's damp, and what I'm adding in is basically equally damp, I'm not adding a ton of excess water, things can flow and blend. But as soon as the things start to dry over here, where the water's not able to blend smoothly with what I've added it to, that's where I get that bloom and that line. Now let's move back over to this area here. And you can see a little bit of a bloom there too. I dripped here, so that's starting to make a bloom here. What I have is an imbalance in how much water is on the page. I've got this very wet drip right here, and it's not really, it's kind of hindered in moving where it wants to go, and in having that freedom of movement, because things are starting to dry. And the drier the page is, the less movement we're going to get. And water that doesn't have a place to go tends to want to, you know, it's going to stop, it's going to not move anymore, and you're going to get that little bloomy edge. Just the same as we have a nice crisp edge here where wet paint and water meets dry paper. When you've got that wet paint and not in an imbalance, I'm not sure, it's not something you can always predict. Sometimes things are wetter than they look, but anytime you have an imbalance between how much water and the water being hindered from moving on the page, you're gonna get an edge. And whether that edge is happening on the edge of a dry piece of paper, or within a wash that you thought was wet but was really starting to dry to the stage where you can't freely add color, which is what's, what happens when we get these blooms here. That is what creates our blooms that we don't want to have happen, or that maybe you need to be a little more aware of how dry things are getting, because as soon as they start to get so dry that the water can't flow, or the paint and pigment can't flow freely, then you're going to start getting those blooms. And as long as they're kind of shiny, like over here, they've got a bit of a sheen to it. And as you can see, my violet did spread nicely. I'm not getting that bloom. So, things were wet enough that it could move. But as soon as it starts to lose its shininess, that's where you start seeing those edges and those cauliflowers kind of happening. Let's see if I can make it happen again over here. Dripping in a drop of water and just seeing what it's going to do. Water tends to want to move, and as it moves, it will move a bit of the pigment as well on the page, and that's where that bloom comes from. So just take the time to observe. I like to call it the point of no return. And when you see that shine is lost, it's very difficult to keep adding pigment. And that can be your best friend, because we tend to want to fuss and fidget with our paintings rather than letting things dry, starting with a fresh layer of color after it's completely dry and building on what we've already created. So I hope that helps you understand where these blooms are coming from and how to kind of be watchful of them and prevent them from happening. And I think the best way to prevent them from happening is just not to fuss overly much with your paintings.